The courthouse in downtown Chicago was unusually crowded that morning. The marble floors echoed with the shuffle of shoes, and murmurs of speculation drifted through the air like smoke. It wasn't just another trial this case had captured. Headlines across the city. Reporters leaned against the cold walls outside, cameras ready, eager to capture any detail of what was expected to be a dramatic showdown. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. At the center of it all was Emily Carter, a 12-year-old girl whose courage had brought her into the intimidating world of adults and law. She walked slowly, her small frame dwarfed by the towering double doors that led into courtroom 7B. Her hand tightened around the leash she was holding. At the other end of it, padding loyally by her side, was Max, a golden retriever with calm, watchful eyes. Gasps rippled through the crowd the moment she entered. "Is that a dog?" one man muttered under his breath. A woman seated on the aisle laughed quietly. "What is this, a circus?" Emily's cheeks flushed, but she kept her chin up. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Some pitied her, others mocked, and some were simply curious. But none of them knew the truth about Max. None of them understood why he was there, and what he could do. At the defense table sat her father, Michael Carter, his once proud shoulders now slumped under the strain of weeks in custody. Once a respected school principal, he now stood accused of serious fraud charges that threatened to put him behind bars for decades. The prosecution claimed they had ironclad evidence, paper trails, bank records, and witnesses ready to testify. To the outside world, Michael looked guilty. To Emily, he was simply her dad, her protector, her hero, the man who read her bedtime stories and walked her to school every morning. The judge, a tall woman with gray hair tied back in a severe bun, glanced over her glasses at the scene unfolding. Before her, she raised one eyebrow at the sight of the dog, but said nothing. Her gavel rested in her hand, ready to restore order if needed. "Your Honor," the prosecutor, Alan Graves, said with a smirk, "this is highly irregular. Are we seriously allowing a child to stroll into this courtroom with her pet?" Laughter bubbled from the gallery, quickly hushed by the judge's sharp glare. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the sting of embarrassment press against her chest. Max nudged her leg gently, as if reminding her that she wasn't alone. The judge's voice cut through the whispers. "Miss Carter, do you understand this is a courtroom, not a playground?" Emily nodded quickly, clutching Max's leash tighter. "Yes, Your Honor, but Max isn't just a pet. He helps tell the truth." The courtroom erupted in scoffs and mutters. The prosecutor shook his head, his smile widening as though he had just been handed an easy victory. "Truth? With all due respect, this is ridiculous. We have no room for fairy tales here." But Emily's eyes never left the judge. She took a shaky step forward, her voice quivering but firm. "Please, you don't have to believe me. Just let him stay. One chance. That's all I'm asking." The room grew quiet again. Something in her voice, the trembling innocence mixed with determination, seemed to pierce through the cynicism that hung heavy in the courtroom. The judge studied her for a long moment, tapping her gavel lightly against the bench. "Very well," she said at last, surprising everyone. "The dog may stay for now. But if this turns into a distraction, I'll have him removed immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." Relief flooded Emily's chest. Max sat obediently at her feet, his tail sweeping the polished floor once, twice, before settling. His calmness seemed to mock the skeptics around him. The trial began, but the room was no longer the same. Everyone's attention, though forced, back onto the opening statements, kept drifting to the small girl and her golden retriever. The prosecutor presented his case with confidence, pacing before the jury, holding up documents and photographs, as though each one was a nail in Michael Carter's coffin. He painted a picture of a dishonest man, a thief who betrayed his position of trust. But Emily knew better. She had seen the strain in her father's eyes, the honesty in his trembling hands. She knew he wasn't capable of what they claimed. And she knew Max could prove it, if only they would give him the chance. As the prosecutor droned on, mocking glances kept landing on Emily and her dog. One juror hid a smile behind his hand. Another shook her head in disbelief. "This is absurd," someone whispered from the gallery. But Max didn't move. His eyes followed every word, every gesture, his head tilting slightly, as if he understood far more than anyone believed. Emily kept her hand on his back, drawing strength from his steady presence. She remembered the nights after her mother passed away, when she'd cry into her pillow, thinking no one would hear. But Max had always heard. He had nudged her, licked away her tears, and somehow sensed the emotions she couldn't put into words. And now, standing in this room filled with doubters, she needed him more than ever. The prosecutor's final words echoed. "The evidence against Michael Carter is overwhelming. No dog, no matter how clever, can erase the facts." Emily's stomach tightened, but she stayed silent. Her moment hadn't come yet. When it did, she knew Max would show them all. The judge banged her gavel lightly. "Court will recess for 15 minutes. We will resume shortly." As people stood and filed out, more laughter echoed. "The dog helps tell the truth? That's the funniest thing I've heard all week," one man said. "Poor kid. She doesn't understand how the real world works," another woman whispered. Emily heard every word, and each one stung like a thorn. She looked down at Max, who gazed up at her with steady eyes, unbothered. His presence was a quiet promise. No matter how loud the world laughed, he would stand by her. And in that moment, Emily decided something. She wasn't here to entertain them. She wasn't here to be mocked. She was here to prove, once and for all, that Max was no joke. When the recess ended, she would ask for her chance. And when she got it, the world would never look at her or her dog the same way again. When the recess ended, the courtroom seemed to hum with a strange energy. People shuffled back into their seats, still whispering about the little girl and her golden retriever. Some were amused, some annoyed, and a few, though they wouldn't admit it, were curious. Emily sat quietly beside her father at the defense table, Max curled loyally at her feet. She smoothed the dog's fur with nervous hands, trying to calm her own pounding heart. Every glance, every smirk from the gallery reminded her that no one here took her seriously. To them, she was just a desperate child with a dog, but she knew the truth. And Max knew it too. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge re-entered. The heavy door slammed behind her, cutting off the last of the murmurs. She adjusted her robe, sat down, and gave a short nod. "Proceed," she said firmly. The prosecutor, Alan Graves, strode to the center of the room with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. His voice carried easily, sharp and theatrical. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing with deliberate slowness, "you have seen the evidence. Bank statements, signed documents, sworn testimonies. Every piece points to the same undeniable conclusion. Michael Carter knowingly defrauded the very community he promised to serve. He is not just guilty, he is dishonest to his core." He paused dramatically, his eyes sweeping the jury box. And yet, instead of facing the truth, the defense parades a child before you. A child holding a dog, as though this is a stage play and not a courtroom of law. Snickers rose from the gallery, but the judge's gavel cracked down, silencing them. Graves smirked anyway. He thrived on spectacle. Emily bit her lip. The words stung, but she lifted her chin. She wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of them. Max nudged her ankle, sensing her tension, and she exhaled slowly. Graves continued. The defendant's daughter believes this dog. He jabbed a finger toward Max, and somehow determined truth from lies. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not living in a fairy tale. We are governed by evidence, by fact, by logic, not by wagging tails and childish fantasies. He turned back toward the defense table, his eyes gleaming. The truth is, this entire spectacle is nothing more than a desperate attempt to distract you from overwhelming evidence. Don't let yourself be fooled. The prosecutor's words echoed through the courtroom, landing heavily in the silence that followed. Emily's father sat rigid, his jaw tight, but his eyes softened when they met his daughter's. He didn't say anything, but the silent message was clear. You're brave, Emily. Braver than I could ever be. The defense attorney, a weary man, in his 50s, shuffled papers on his desk, clearly unconvinced that Emily's plan would amount to anything. He had already told her privately that relying on Max was a long shot, one that could easily backfire. But Emily had been insistent. And though her attorney wasn't optimistic, he had little choice but to let her speak. The judge leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the bench. Miss Carter, she said carefully, you claim your dog can help us determine the truth. Would you care to explain? Emily's stomach fluttered. The moment she'd been waiting for was finally here. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. Your Honor, Max isn't just my dog. He's been trained to sense emotions, fear, stress, dishonesty. He can tell when people are hiding something. He's done it for me before, and I believe he can do it now. Laughter erupted again, though this time it was quieter, restrained. A few jurors raised skeptical eyebrows. The prosecutor threw up his hands. Your Honor, this is absurd. This is not a pet show. This is a trial. Allowing this child to demonstrate with her dog insults the very foundation of our justice system. But Emily pressed on, ignoring him. She looked at the judge, her eyes shining with quiet determination. I know it sounds strange. I know most people don't believe me. But please, just one chance. Let Max show you. For a long, tense moment, the judge said nothing. The courtroom held its breath. Even Graves stopped pacing, narrowing his eyes, sensing a crack in the judge's composure. Finally, the judge spoke. I am hesitant, she admitted. But this case has raised unusual circumstances, and the credibility of testimony is central to its resolution. One will allow the demonstration. One chance, Miss Carter. Use it wisely. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. Emily's pulse quickened. She nodded gratefully, whispering to Max, This is it, boy. Just like we practiced. Max thumped his tail once against the floor as if he understood. The prosecutor scoffed loudly. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a waste of the court's time. You are allowing a dog to serve as a lie detector. The judge shot him a sharp look. You've made your objection clear, Mr. Graves. It is overruled. Sit down. Graves clenched his jaw, but obeyed, retreating with a glare that could have cut steel. All eyes shifted to Emily. She took a shaky step toward the witness stand, Max padding beside her. Her hands trembled, but she held her head high. She knelt beside Max, her voice gentle but audible. Okay, Max, let's start simple. The courtroom leaned forward, curiosity battling skepticism. Max, she said softly, do you love me? Max's tail wagged, and he pressed a paw firmly into her lap. The gallery chuckled. Someone muttered, cute, cute. Emily didn't flinch. She looked back up at the judge. Now watch this. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and asked the question that mattered most. Max, is my father lying when he says he's innocent? The room froze. Max sat still, his body calm, his gaze unwavering. No growl, no bark, no shift in posture. Just silent, steady, calm silence. The laughter stopped instantly. Emily turned back toward the jury, her voice trembling but clear. "See? He knows." The prosecutor sprang to his feet. "This proves nothing. Dogs respond to tone, to body language, not to truth." But Emily wasn't done. Her eyes flicked toward Graves, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she felt a spark of courage burn right within her. "Then let's ask Max about you," she said boldly. The room erupted in gasps. Graves froze, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Emily looked directly at him. "You said you're certain about all the evidence. Let's see what Max thinks." The judge hesitated, clearly weighing the risks, but curiosity won out. She nodded once. "Proceed." Emily's heart raced. She turned back to Max. "Max, is Mr. Graves telling the truth when he says he's certain all his evidence is true?" Max's ears pricked. His body stiffened. And then low, steady, unmistakable, he growled. The sound was soft at first, but it rumbled through the silent courtroom like thunder. Every juror sat forward in their seats. The gallery gaped. The prosecutor's face flushed crimson. The laughter was gone. The smirks were gone. And for the first time since the trial began, doubt flickered in the room. Max, the dog everyone had dismissed as a joke, had just shaken the foundation of the prosecution's case. The silence after Max's growl was thick enough to feel. The sound had been low, steady, not a bark, not excitement, but something unmistakably warning. It wasn't the kind of growl a dog made when it wanted to play. It was the kind of growl that said something was wrong. The jurors shifted uneasily in their seats. A woman in the second row crossed her arms tightly, her eyes darting between Max and the prosecutor. Another juror leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the retriever as though he had just witnessed something beyond explanation. Alan Graves, the prosecutor, forced a laugh that came out sharper than intended. "Oh, come now. This is theater. A parlor trick at best." His voice wavered slightly, betraying nerves. Emily straightened, her small frame trembling but unyielding. "It's not a trick," she said, her voice clear despite the lump in her throat. "Max knows when someone isn't telling the truth. He's never wrong." The judge, who had watched the exchange without expression, adjusted her glasses. Her eyes lingered on Graves for a moment longer than necessary before she turned back. To Emily, "Miss Carter, continue carefully." Emily nodded. She crouched beside Max, whispering into his ear, though her words carried enough for the courtroom to hear. "You're doing so good, Max, just like we practiced." The dog wagged his tail once, then fell back into stillness, his eyes locked on the room as though scanning every movement, every word. Emily rose to her feet, her confidence growing with every second the courtroom remained entranced. "Your Honor, may I try a few more questions?" The judge hesitated. "This is highly unorthodox, but..." Her eyes flickered briefly, just briefly, with something softer, almost curious. "Go on." Emily turned back to Max. "Max, am I standing right now?" The dog remained calm, eyes steady, tail giving a slow wag. "And am I sitting down?" she asked. Max let out a short, sharp huff through his nose, as though rejecting the question. A ripple of laughter, this time tinged with unease, moved through the gallery. Emily pointed toward the bailiff, a tall man with broad shoulders. "Max, is that man wearing a black uniform?" Max's tail thumped against the floor. "And is he wearing a red dress?" A sudden low growl rumbled from the dog's chest. The laughter that followed wasn't mocking this time. It was nervous, disbelieving. People exchanged looks, eyebrows raised, whispers tumbling through the gallery. Emily swallowed, pressing forward before doubt could creep back in. She turned toward her father, who sat at the defense table, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "Max," she said softly, "is my dad lying when he says he's innocent?" Every sound in the courtroom vanished. Even the creak of wooden benches seemed to hold its breath. Max sat tall, eyes on Michael Carter. He tilted his head once, then lowered it slowly, resting his chin on his paws. No growl, no bark, just calm stillness. It was as though the air itself cracked. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God." Michael's eyes glistened. For weeks he had been painted as a villain, his protests of innocence drowned out by evidence. But now, with nothing but silence, his daughter's dog had given him more validation than months of legal arguments ever had. The prosecutor slammed his hand against the table. "This is outrageous," he shouted. His voice cracked, betraying his temper. "Are we truly letting a dog pass judgment on a man's fate?" The judge raised her gavel sharply. "Enough. Mr. Graves, you will have your chance to cross-examine." But the room wasn't on his side anymore. Jurors whispered among themselves, some nodding slightly, others avoiding his gaze entirely. Emily turned, her courage burning brighter now. She faced Graves directly. "Mr. Graves, may I ask you something?" He sneered. "You may not. This is not." The judge cut him off. "Answer her question." Emily stepped closer, Max moving with her, his eyes following every flicker of movement. She kept her voice steady. "You've told this court you are absolutely certain of your evidence. Are you telling the truth?" Graves straightened, puffing out his chest. "Of course I am." Emily looked at Max. "Is Mr. Graves telling the truth?" The dog stiffened instantly. His ears pinned back. His lips curled just slightly, and then the growl returned deep, steady, resonant. This time it was louder. The sound reverberated through the wooden floors, into the benches, into the very bones of everyone in the room. A child in the gallery whimpered and clung to her mother. Gasps erupted. Murmurs grew. A juror's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the desk. Emily didn't move, her gaze locked on Max. She whispered softly, so softly only those nearby could hear, "Good boy." The prosecutor's face turned crimson. He sputtered, his words tripping over themselves. This proves nothing. Dogs can be trained." He's just responding to her tone. But even as he said it, his voice faltered. His eyes darted nervously, his confidence shaken. For the first time since the trial began, Alan Graves looked less like the powerful man in control, and more like someone caught in a web he didn't expect. The judge leaned back slowly, studying him. Her face betrayed nothing, but her eyes lingered on him with quiet intensity. The jurors, once dismissive, now wore expressions of confusion, unease, even suspicion. Emily pressed a trembling hand against Max's back, steadying herself. She had done it. She had shown them. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom had laughed at Max before. They had called him a joke. But now, after just one growl, the laughter was gone. Now, people were beginning to wonder, what if the dog wasn't wrong? The echo of Max's growl still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. What had begun as a circus, a sideshow, was turning into something no one could laugh at anymore. The golden retriever sat calmly now, his chest rising and falling. In steady rhythm, but the memory of that warning growl gnawed at the jurors' minds. Emily felt the energy shift. For the first time since she had walked into this room, people weren't just seeing a scared little girl with a dog. They were listening. They were watching. And Max was the reason. The prosecutor, Alan Graves, tried to recover. He smoothed down his tie, his face still flushed from embarrassment. "This is absurd," he said again, but his voice. no longer carried the same commanding authority. Instead, it wavered just slightly, betraying a man rattled. The judge lifted her chin, peering at him over her glasses. "You've made your objection clear, Mr. Graves," she said firmly. "We will move forward." Graves clenched his jaw, but he sat down. Emily swallowed, nerves tightening her throat. She turned to Max, kneeling down to stroke his fur. "Okay, boy," she whispered, "just one more time. We can do this." Max licked her hand once, as if to reassure her. Rising to her feet, Emily addressed the judge. "Your Honor, may I? May I show you how Max can tell the difference between truth and lies?" The judge considered her for a long moment. The weight of the room pressed down, every eye locked. On her decision, finally, she gave a single nod. "You may proceed." Emily took a deep breath and faced the jury. "I'll ask Max some questions. You'll see how he responds differently." She crouched again. "Max, am I 12 years? Old?" The dog wagged his tail once, his expression calm. "And am I 50 years old?" Instantly, a sharp growl rumbled from his chest. Gasps rose again. This time, there was no laughter, only the crackling tension of disbelief. Emily smiled. Nervously. "See? He knows the truth." The jurors exchanged glances. One man leaned toward another, whispering. A woman in the front row pressed her lips together, as if unsure whether to be amazed or afraid. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. The dog is responding to tone and inflection, nothing more." Emily looked directly at him. "Then ask him something yourself." The challenge hung in the air, like a gauntlet thrown. The room went still, all eyes swiveling toward Graves. His nostrils flared. He looked at the judge, expecting her to shut it down, but the judge only raised her brows. "You objected that the dog responds only to tone," she said. "Very well, prove it. Ask your question." For a moment, Graves looked cornered. Then he straightened, adjusting his jacket with a forced confidence. He turned to Max. "Dog," he said coldly. "Is your name Max?" The retriever wagged his tail. "Ha!" Graves barked, triumphant. "See? He's just conditioned." But before his smugness could spread, Emily spoke again. "Max, is his name Max?" The golden retriever's lips curled. A growl rattled the floor. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The jurors stared, eyes wide. Graves's face went scarlet. The judge slammed her gavel. "Order!" Silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. Emily felt her heart race, her hands trembling. She hadn't expected it to work so perfectly, but it had. Max wasn't just convincing the jury, he was exposing cracks in the prosecution's confidence. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Miss Carter, continue." Emily nodded. She turned toward a man sitting quietly at the witness stand, a secondary witness called earlier in the trial. His testimony had seemed straightforward, but Emily had felt something off in his words, though she couldn't prove it. "Max," she said softly, pointing toward the man, "is this person telling the truth?" The golden retriever's head turned slowly toward the witness. He stared for a moment, then gave a sharp growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The man flinched visibly. Gasps filled the air. The witness's hands twitched on the stand. His face paled, beads of sweat gathering at his brow. This is ridiculous," he stammered. "It's just a dog." But his voice cracked, and the jurors saw it. They saw the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted, the way he couldn't hold still. Emily's father watched from the defense table, his chest tightening. For the first time since the trial began, hope flickered in his tired eyes. The prosecutor jumped up again. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. We cannot allow a child and her mutt to undermine sworn testimony. But the judge didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied the witness with narrowed eyes. His sudden discomfort hadn't gone unnoticed. "Miss Carter," the judge said at last, her voice even, "that will be enough for now." She turned to the witness. "You may step down." The man nearly bolted from the stand. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely. What had been laughter and disbelief was now silence and unease. Even those who doubted Max couldn't deny the visible fear he sparked in the witness. Emily sat back down beside her father, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. She stroked Max's fur, whispering, "Good boy. You're amazing." The prosecutor, red-faced and seething, leaned over his table, glaring at them as though willing them out of existence. But the jurors weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Emily, at Max, and for the first time, the tide felt like it was turning. The courtroom was no longer laughing. The courtroom was thick with silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't just hush voices, but seemed to squeeze the air from people's lungs. Every eye was fixed on the witness, who had all but stumbled from the stand, his collar damp with sweat, his hands shaking despite his desperate attempt to appear composed. Emily sat frozen beside her father, her small hand resting on Max's back. She felt his steady breathing, heard the low rumble in his chest that had so effortlessly shaken the witness's facade. For the first time, she realized that Max wasn't just her companion. He was a force in this room, pulling truth into the light. The judge finally broke the silence, her voice measured but sharper than before. "Mr. Graves, please call your next witness." The prosecutor, Alan Graves, stood stiffly, his jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward the jury before landing on Emily and Max, his gaze filled with disdain. "Your Honor, this circus cannot continue. That dog is influencing the perception of sworn testimony. This is not evidence. This is manipulation." The judge adjusted her glasses, her tone cool. "Mr. Graves, perception is influenced by many things: the way a witness speaks, their body language, their composure under cross-examination. If the presence of a dog unsettles a witness to the point of visible distress, perhaps that speaks more to the integrity of the testimony than to the dog itself." A ripple of murmurs passed through the jury box. Emily's father allowed himself the smallest smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, but offered a flicker of hope. For weeks, he had been branded guilty before the trial even began. Now, for the first time, the scales seemed to shift ever so slightly. The prosecutor exhaled sharply, then called his next witness. A woman in her early 40s took the stand. She was dressed neatly, her hair pinned back in a severe bun. She sat upright, projecting confidence. But when her eyes flickered toward Max, her expression faltered. Emily noticed. She always noticed. "State your name for the record," Graves instructed. "Lydia Moore," the woman replied, her voice even. "And your relation to the case?" "I was present the night of the incident," Lydia said firmly. The jury leaned in. This was one of the prosecution's star witnesses, the one who had claimed she saw Emily's father leaving the scene. Graves smiled, as if settling back into control. "And what did you witness on that night?" Lydia's eyes shifted nervously toward Max again. The golden retriever didn't move, didn't growl. He only stared, his calm, intelligent gaze fixed on her like a spotlight she couldn't escape. "I saw him," she said finally, her voice tightening. "I saw Mr. Carter near the warehouse." Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to scream, to tell them Lydia was lying. Instead, she leaned close to Max. "Is she telling the truth?" she whispered. Max let out a sound, not a bark, not quite. A growl, but something in between. A sharp, low rumble that vibrated against Emily's palm. It was enough. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Graves snapped his head toward the defense table. "Objection. This is outrageous." The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her eyes on Lydia, studying her carefully. "Continue, Miss Moore." But Lydia's confidence had already begun to crumble. Her hands clenched, tightly together in her lap, her shoulders rigid. Emily's father's attorney, Mr. Hayes, stood for cross-examination. He was a quiet man, often underestimated, but today there was a sharpened edge to his voice. "Ms. Moore," he said, "how far away were you when you claimed to have seen my client?" "About 50 feet, she said, though the hesitation was clear. "And it was dark, wasn't it?" "Yes, and you were behind." "A row of cars at the time?" Her lips pressed together. "Yes. Yet you're certain it was my client?" Her gaze flicked involuntarily toward Max. The golden retriever sat unmoving, but his eyes never left her. She swallowed hard. I believe it was him." "You believe," Hayes repeated. He let the word hang in the air. Emily held her breath. Max's fur bristled beneath her fingers, and she knew he was ready. She didn't have to say anything. He understood. Lydia's composure cracked further. She shifted in her seat, glancing toward the prosecutor as if for rescue. But Graves was silent, his jaw tight, his face pale. The jury was watching every detail, every nervous twitch, every bead of sweat. Finally, Lydia blurted out, "I thought it was him, all right? I thought because Graves told me he was the suspect that it had to be him." The words exploded into the room like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. The jury leaned forward, some with mouths open. Graves shot to his feet. "Objection." "She's confused under pressure." "Overruled," the judge said sharply. Her eyes locked on Lydia. "You will answer truthfully, Miss Moore." Lydia's shoulders sagged. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I never saw his face. I only saw a man leaving, but I can't say it was Mr. Carter. I can't swear to that." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She turned to Max, hugging him tightly. "You did it," she whispered into his fur. "You helped her tell the truth." The judge sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. But for the first time, Emily thought she saw something softer in her eyes. The jurors exchanged murmurs, the tension in the room electrifying. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't even skeptical. They were shaken. Graves tried to regain control, his voice rising. "This is preposterous. The girl and her dog are undermining the entire judicial process." But the damage was done. The jury had seen Lydia unravel under Max's unyielding gaze. They had heard her confession that her testimony was built on assumption, not fact. And they would not forget it. Emily sat back down, still clinging. To Max, her father's hand reached across the table, brushing her arm gently. For the first time, she saw hope in his eyes. The truth wasn't fully out yet, but the cracks had begun. And Max had started the avalanche. The courtroom had become a battlefield, though no one raised a weapon and no one fired a shot. Instead, words, glances, and silence themselves carried the weight of war. Emily felt it in her chest, the storm shifting, the tide moving. Lydia. Moore's collapse had shaken the prosecution's once perfect narrative, and for the first time since her father's arrest, Emily saw the jurors looking at him differently, not as a monster, not as a man already condemned, but as someone they might actually doubt was guilty. Max lay at her feet, calm but alert, his steady eyes never leaving the witness stand. The prosecutor, Alan Graves, was pale with frustration. His jaw twitched as he shuffled through his files, his composure hanging by a thread. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "the defense has manipulated this courtroom long enough. But the next witness will make it clear who the guilty party is." The judge, who had remained cool and professional throughout the trial, raised her eyebrows but said nothing. She gestured toward the bailiff. A man entered the room, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp suit that strained against his thick frame. His name was Richard Hall, a security guard who had been working near the warehouse the night of the crime. He carried himself with a kind of forced confidence, a kind of swagger that masked unease. Emily noticed immediately. His eyes avoided Max. "Mr. Hall," Graves began, his voice steadier now that he had his new weapon. "Please tell the court what you saw on the night of the incident." Hawley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the witness stand. "I saw him," he said firmly, pointing toward Emily's father. "I saw Carter leaving the warehouse just after the alarms went off. He looked guilty, nervous, like someone who didn't belong there." The jury shifted, murmurs running like ripples across water. Graves smiled, his confidence returning. Emily clutched Max's fur tightly. "No," she whispered. "He's lying. I can feel it." Max's ears pricked. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He only stared at Richard Hawley with the same unflinching gaze he had used on Lydia. It was steady, quiet, relentless. And then it began. Richard Hale's voice faltered ever so slightly. It was a tiny crack, almost imperceptible, but to Emily, it was a thunderclap. "He was, moving quickly," Hawley said, his earlier confidence draining. "I knew it was him, because—" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward Max, before quickly shifting away. "Because I recognized his jacket." Mr. Hayes, the defense attorney, rose smoothly. "Mr. Hawley," he said, "how long had you been working that night before this alleged sighting?" 6 hours, Hawley said quickly. "I was alert. I know what I saw. And it was dark?" "Yes. But the area had lights. I couldn't mistake it." Hayes nodded slowly. "Couldn't mistake it? Or were you told not to?" Graves shot up. "Objection." The judge narrowed her eyes. "Sustained. Careful, Mr. Hayes." But Hayes wasn't finished. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Hall. "You mentioned you recognized the jacket. Wasn't it standard issue for dozens of workers in that district?" Hawley hesitated again. "Well, yes, but—" "And did you see the man's face?" I thought I did." "Thought?" Hayes pounced, or assumed. The courtroom hung on the question. Max shifted slightly, his head tilting. Emily could feel the subtle tension in his body, like he was ready to pounce on something unseen. His eyes never blinked, never wavered. Richard Hale's voice cracked. I assumed." The word fell like a hammer. The jury gasped. The judge leaned forward, her face unreadable. Hayes pressed harder. "Mr. Hawley, you're under oath. Did you see my client's face that night?" Hale's forehead beaded with sweat. He tried to look anywhere but at Max, but the dog's gaze pinned him down like a spotlight he couldn't escape. "No," Hawley whispered finally. "I didn't see his face. I just saw someone leaving. Graves told me it was Carter. That's why I said it was him." The room exploded in murmurs. The judge slammed her gavel. Order! Order in the court! But no one could ignore what had just happened. A second witness, another so-called pillar of the prosecution, had cracked under pressure, revealing that his testimony wasn't fact but assumption, manipulated by the prosecutor himself. Emily's father turned to her, his eyes glistening. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a small smile. Graves, however, was livid. His face flushed crimson as he rose to his feet. "Your Honor, I cannot continue like this. This animal is destroying the sanctity of this trial. It is influencing the jury, frightening witnesses, and making a mockery of the law." The judge didn't answer immediately. She stared at Max, who sat calmly at Emily's side, tail curled neatly around his body, eyes glowing with quiet certainty. And then, to everyone's shock, she said softly, "Or perhaps it is revealing more than any of us dared to see." The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Graves sputtered, "Your Honor, this is outrageous." But the judge raised a hand. "Mr. Graves, enough. We will continue tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." She struck the gavel and stood abruptly. Her face, normally a mask of composure, was pale. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say more, but didn't. Then, in a move that stunned the courtroom, Judge Thompson walked out quickly, her eyes wet with tears. Emily stared, her mouth open. She had never seen a judge cry before. The bailiff announced the adjournment, but no one moved immediately. The jurors whispered among themselves. The reporters scribbled furiously, and Emily clung to Max as though he were the only anchor in a sea of chaos. The cracks in the case had become fractures, and now even the judge was no longer unshaken. When Judge Thompson left the courtroom in tears, silence swallowed the chamber. Even the sound of shuffling papers died away. Reporters lowered their pens. The jury exchanged puzzled glances. Everyone knew judges were meant to be impartial, composed, unshakable. To see one crumble in plain sight felt like watching the very pillars of justice crack. Emily clutched Max tightly, her own heart racing. She whispered into his fur, "What just happened, boy? Why did she cry?" Max's ears twitched, but he didn't move. His amber eyes fixed on the door through which Judge Thompson had disappeared, as though he understood something no human could. Mr. Hayes leaned toward Emily's father. "This changes everything," he murmured. The jury saw it. They saw not only another witness collapse, but the judge herself walk out, shaken. Graves' case is unraveling. Graves himself looked like a storm bottled inside a man. His hands trembled as he stuffed papers into his briefcase, jaw clenching hard enough that his teeth audibly clicked. He had built this trial to be perfect, airtight, yet twice now, witnesses he had prepared had disintegrated under the stare of a dog. The bailiff's voice broke the silence. "All rise." But this time, it wasn't for the judge. It was for dismissal. The jurors filed out slowly, whispering to one another, their once confident expressions now fractured with doubt. Emily followed her father and Hayes outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun spilling over the stone steps. Reporters swarmed like bees, their microphones thrust forward, questions raining down. Is it true the judge cried? What role does the dog really play? Do you believe this case is already won? Hayes shielded Emily with his arm. "No comments," he said firmly, ushering them past the chaos. But that night, as Emily lay awake in the small apartment where she and Max were staying, her mind refused to quiet. She couldn't stop replaying the image of Judge Thompson's tear-streaked face. Judges didn't cry for nothing. Something had cracked inside her. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with a fevered energy. Everyone had heard the whispers, read the headlines, seen the photographs splashed across newspapers. Judge breaks down in trial, and dog stares down witness, truth emerges. When Judge Thompson entered, her face was calm again, but her eyes betrayed a shadow. She took her seat and struck the gavel. Court is now in session. Alan Graves wasted no time. He rose, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, before we proceed, with further witnesses, I must address what has become an intolerable disruption. This dog is not evidence. It is not counsel. It is not a participant in this trial. And yet its presence is dismantling the very process of justice. I move that the animal be removed immediately." Emily's heart seized. She looked down at Max, who gazed calmly ahead as though the words had no power over him. But she knew if Max left, they lost their greatest defender. Hayes stood, his voice calm, but resolute. Your Honor, the defense has not introduced the dog as evidence. The dog is here as a support animal for Emily, nothing more. If witnesses crumble under its gaze, perhaps that speaks more to the weight of their own consciences than to any disruption. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The judge didn't answer immediately. She looked at Max, her face unreadable. Then she said softly, "Motion denied. The dog remains." Emily released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But it wasn't over. After a brief recess, the judge called the court back into session. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled her papers. Then, in an unexpected move, she said, "Before we hear further testimony, I have a statement to make. This is highly irregular, but in light of what transpired yesterday, I feel compelled to explain myself." The courtroom froze. Judges did not make statements like this, not in the middle of a trial. Judge Thompson's voice quivered, but she pressed on. "When I saw that dog stare at Mr. Hawley yesterday, I remembered something I had buried for years. A case many years ago, when I was still a young attorney. A man stood accused of theft. The evidence was stacked against him. Witness after witness swore they saw him. But his daughter brought in their dog, and that dog behaved in the exact same way. It refused to look away from the real thief. And in time, the truth unraveled. That man was acquitted. That case was one of the reasons I became a judge, to uphold truth, not just procedure." Her voice broke. She paused, her eyes glistening again. "I walked out yesterday because I felt the weight of that memory crush me. I realized I had seen this before, this strange, impossible, but undeniable ability of a dog to pierce through deception. And I wondered, have I already let injustice happen in this courtroom by dismissing what is plain before my eyes?" Gasps swept through the crowd. Emily's heart pounded. She reached down, stroking Max's head. "You've done this before," she whispered. "You've saved someone before." Graves erupted. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot let superstition and animal behavior dictate the fate of a trial. This is a court of law, not a circus." But for the first time, Graves looked like the one out of control, while the judge looked human, raw, and honest. Judge Thompson wiped her eyes and steadied herself. "You are correct, Mr. Graves. This is a court of law, and law requires truth. If your witnesses cannot withstand the gaze of a dog, then perhaps the jury should question why." The room thundered with whispers. For Emily, the moment felt surreal. Max wasn't just her protector anymore. He had become a force shifting the very foundation of the trial. The judge had admitted her own faith in what everyone else had dismissed as a joke. And then the true bombshell fell. Judge Thompson leaned forward, her voice dropping lower. "I must also disclose something. Years ago, I lost someone very close to me to a wrongful conviction. Evidence had been twisted, witnesses pressured, the truth buried under lies. That loss still haunts me. Yesterday, I saw the same patterns, the same fractures, repeating here. That is why I walked out. Not because I was weak, but because I recognized the ghost of the past staring me in the face." The entire courtroom seemed to breathe, as one, heavy and stunned. Emily's father bowed his head, his hands trembling. For the first time, he believed he might be free. Max remained still, but his eyes glowed with quiet certainty, as though he had known all along that this revelation would come. The trial was no longer just about Emily's father. It had become something bigger, a reckoning with justice itself. And with one part left, Emily knew the truth was finally ready to shatter everything. The courtroom buzzed with a nervous electricity when Judge Thompson's confession ended. People sat stunned, some leaning forward on the wooden benches, others whispering feverishly. Even the reporters, who usually scribbled without pause, seemed caught in the silence, their pens frozen mid-sentence. The air carried a weight, heavy with the possibility that this trial was no longer about evidence and arguments, but about whether truth itself could be denied any longer. Emily sat with Max, pressed against her side, feeling his steady warmth. His calmness gave her courage. He hadn't wavered once, not when the witnesses lied, not when the judge cried, not even when Graves thundered with fury. Max simply was, and in his presence, lies seemed to unravel. Alan Graves, however, wasn't finished. His face was flushed crimson, his composure shattered. He rose to his feet and pointed at Emily's father. This mockery has gone too far. He shouted, his voice echoing off the high wooden panels. Your Honor, members of the jury, this man is guilty. Guilty of theft, fraud, and deception. You've all seen the evidence, records, statements, witnesses. Are we to toss all that aside because of a dog? He spat the word like venom. The jury shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the witnesses falter. They had seen the judge break down. Graves' voice, once commanding, now sounded desperate. Hayes rose calmly. Your Honor, the prosecution has given us records, statements, and witnesses, yes. But every piece of evidence falls apart under scrutiny. Every witness has cracked under oath. What remains is the question. Why? Why do they falter in front of this dog? Why does their confidence crumble the moment Max looks at them? He turned to the jury, his voice steady and deliberate. Because lies cannot stand in the presence of truth. Gasps rippled through the room. Graves slammed his fist on the table. This is theatrics, nonsense, he whirled to the jury. Don't let this circus blind you. The law does not bend for fairy tales about animals. But before anyone could respond, Max suddenly rose from Emily's side. His ears pricked forward, his body stiff. The courtroom froze. All eyes followed the dog as he walked not toward Emily's father, not toward the jury, but straight toward Graves. The prosecutor froze in place, his voice catching in his throat. Max stopped just a foot away from him, lifted his head, and locked eyes with him. That same piercing stare that had unmade every lying witness now bore into Graves. The silence was unbearable. Graves' hands shook. His jaw twitched. Sweat pooled on his forehead. He tried to look away, but Max would not let him. The dog's gaze pinned him like a weight, stripping away his polished mask of control. Mr. Graves, Judge Thompson said slowly, her voice firm, is there something you wish to disclose to this court? Graves swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. No, nothing, he muttered, looking down, but his voice cracked. Answer clearly, the judge pressed, her eyes narrowing. Max growled a low, deep rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't aggression. It was pressure. And it worked. Graves collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders trembled. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, broken. It wasn't supposed to go this far. His words spilled out like a flood. I tampered with the evidence. Hallie was never supposed to testify, but they forced him. The records were rewritten. The witnesses coached. I thought I was protecting the firm, my career, my reputation. I never meant to frame an innocent man. But once it started, I couldn't stop. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters leapt to their feet, cameras flashing wildly, the crowd roaring with disbelief. The jury gasped, some covering their mouths in shock. Judge Thompson banged her gavel furiously. Order, order in the court. But the damage was done. The truth was out. Emily felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at Max, who stood calmly, his gaze unwavering, as though he had known this would be the outcome all along. Graves continued, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry." His body slumped, his shoulders caving inward, as though he had been carrying a mountain that finally crushed him. Judge Thompson's voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Graves, you are hereby held in contempt of this court. Bailiff, take him into custody immediately. This trial is over." The bailiff moved swiftly, placing a hand on Graves' shoulder. The once powerful prosecutor did not resist. His eyes were hollow, broken. Then the judge turned to Emily's father. Her voice softened. "Sir, you are free. The charges against you are dismissed. You have been wrongfully accused, and this court owes you more than an apology. It owes you back your life." Emily's father broke down, tears spilling freely. He reached for Emily, pulling her into his arms. "I told you, sweetheart," he whispered through sobs. "I told you I was innocent." Emily clung to him, sobbing into his chest. "I never doubted you, Dad. Not once." Max knew too. The courtroom, once filled with chaos, now erupted into applause. Even the jurors, who were supposed to remain silent, clapped through their tears. The gallery stood, cheering, crying, shouting words of relief and joy. And in the middle of it all, Max sat calmly, tail wagging once, as though satisfied his work was done. That evening, as the courthouse steps emptied, Emily, her father, Hayes, and Max stood together under the setting sun. Reporters still swarmed, but their questions were no longer sharp. They were reverent, curious, almost awed. Is it true the dog revealed the truth? Will this change how trials are conducted in the future? What do you say to those who call this divine intervention? Hayes smiled softly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. I say justice takes many forms. Sometimes it's paper and evidence. Sometimes it's courage. And sometimes it's a dog who simply refuses to let lies win. Judge Thompson stepped outside then, her robes folded neatly, her face weary but peaceful. She walked over to Emily and knelt in front of Max. Her hand trembled as she stroked his head. Thank you, she whispered. You reminded me why I became what I am. You reminded me that truth isn't always found in books or laws. Sometimes it's found in the simplest eyes of all. Emily's eyes filled with tears again. She hugged Max tightly, burying her face in his fur. He's not just a dog, she said softly. He's family. And he saved us. The judge nodded, tears glistening in her own eyes. She stood and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. Take care of him. He's a gift. And with that, Judge Thompson walked away, her figure framed by the golden horizon. A woman changed forever by what she had witnessed. In the weeks that followed, the story spread across the nation. Headlines screamed, Dog exposes prosecutor's lies in courtroom. Stuns as canine reveals truth. People debated whether it was instinct, training, or something deeper, something unexplainable. But for Emily, it didn't matter. What mattered was that her father was free, Max had stood by them, and justice, real justice, had prevailed. One night, as she sat on the porch with Max beside her, she whispered, They all dismissed you as a joke. Max, but you showed them. You showed everyone. Max turned his head, licking her cheek gently, before resting it on her lap with a deep sigh. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt safe, because she knew the truth. Max wasn't just her dog, he was her guardian. And he had made even a judge cry.